Dragon Age Origins was rated M for mature by the ESRB and contains blood, intense violence, language, partial nudity, and sexual content. Viewer discretion is advised. Hello everyone, my name is Amaronith and I play games for the internet, and today we're playing Dragon Age Origins. Having rescued Arl Eamon from the terrible curse that afflicted him with a pinch of the sacred ashes of beloved Andraste, it's time for another Codex reading. Starting with Article 6, Bronto. There's only two things a noble will step aside for: paragons and angry Brontos. A dwarven saying. This hulking beast was originally bred by the dwarven Shaperit as a beast of burden and food source, the rough equivalent to a surface oxen and cows. Some versions of Bronto have even been developed as dwarven mounts, valued far more for their sure-footedness and stamina than for their speed. While present within Orzammar in large numbers, some Brontos still exist in packs within the deep roads, having returned to a wild state after the fall of the Dwarven Kingdoms. They require remarkably little sustenance, consuming organic material from water, fungus, and even rocks, hence the rock liquor appellation used by many dwarves to describe Bronto, and exist in primarily dormant states until provoked. An angry, charging Bronto is considered to be a rather dangerous opponent. And Article 11, Dragon. Dragonlings. Newly hatched dragons are roughly the size of a deer and ferociously hungry. They live for a short time in their mother's lair before venturing out on their own. The slender, wingless creatures are born in vast numbers, as only a few ever make it to adulthood. Drakes. Male dragons never develop into the winged monsters of myth. At most, their forelegs grow in the vestigial spurs where wing membrane might have been. Once they have fully matured, males immediately seek out the lairs of adult females. When they find one, they move into her lair and spend the rest of their lives there, hunting for her and defending her young. They will aggressively defend her nest, and many would-be dragon hunters have been lost to their fiery breath and crushing blows from their tails. Dragons. Female dragons take much longer to mature than their male counterparts. They, too, undergo a metamorphosis of sorts at adulthood, but while males lose the use of their forepaws, females actually grow a third set of limbs specifically to serve as wings. Young females travel great distances looking for a suitable nesting site. Because of their nomadic habits, these are the dragons most frequently encountered by man. Article 45, the Life Drinker. No one knows for certain where this amulet came from. All we have is a legend. Long before the Golden City turned black, there lived in the Tevinter Imperium a frail old magician in the court of the Archon. He was the least among the mages of the court, the lamplighter, whose task it was to set all the thousands of candles alight and snuff them out again when the Archon retired for the evening. I added a word in there. And snuff them again when the Archon retired for the evening. He was counted as useless by all the most influential magisters, but he was only biding his time. One day, when all the magisters of the Imperium were assembled in the great hall of the Archon, the lamplighter struck. He conjured a massive firestorm in the hall, trying to assassinate all who were assembled and seize power himself. The court was made up of the most powerful mages of the Imperium, and they worked quickly to destroy the would-be usurper, but found, to their astonishment, their magic was no match for the old mage. Every spell they cast was countered, and the magisters began to fall one by one, until only the Archon himself and the lamplighter were left, locked in a battle of magic and will. The Archon saw that with each spell he cast, the lamplighter himself seemed to wither and fade a little more. So he bombarded the mage with spell after spell, until at last nothing was left of the palace but rubble, and nothing there. Until nothing gosh. So he bombarded the mage with spell after spell, until at last nothing was left of the palace but rubble, nothing left of the court but corpses, and nothing left of the lamplighter but a golden pendant. This the Archon kept to remind himself that treachery could come from even the most innocuous of sources. Sorry about that. I couldn't make my mouth work for some reason. Article 62. Andraste, Bride of the Maker. There was once a tiny fishing village on the waking sea that was set upon by the Tevinter Imperium, which enslaved the villagers to be sold in the markets of Minrathous, leaving behind only the old and the infirm. One of the captives was the child Andraste. She was raised in slavery in a foreign land. She escaped, then made the long and treacherous journey back to her homeland alone. She rose from nothing to be the wife of an Alamari warlord. Each day she sang to the gods, asking them to help her people who remained slaves in Tevinter. The false gods of the mountains and the winds did not answer her, but the true God did. The Maker spoke. He showed her all the works of his hands, the Fade, the world, and all the creatures therein. He showed her how men had forgotten him, lavishing devotion upon mute idols and demons, how he had left them to their fate. But her voice had reached him, and so captivated him that he offered her a place at his side, that she might rule all of creation. But Andraste would not forsake her people. She begged the Maker to return, to save his children from the cruelty of the Imperium. Reluctantly, the Maker agreed to give man another chance. Andraste went back to her husband, Maferath, and told him all that the Maker had revealed to her. Together they rallied the Alamari and marched forth against the mage lords of the Imperium, and the Maker was with them. The Maker's sword was creation itself, fire and flood, famine and earthquake. Everywhere they went, Andraste sang to the people of the Maker, and they heard her. The ranks of Andraste's followers grew until they were a vast tide washing over the Imperium. When Maferath saw that the people loved Andraste and not him, a worm grew within his heart, gnawing upon it. At last the armies of Andraste and Maferath stood before the very gates of Minrathous, but Andraste was not with them, for Maferath had schemed in secret to hand Andraste over to the Tevinter. For this the Archon would give Maferath all the lands to the south of the waking sea. And so before all the armies of the Alamari and of Tevinter, Andraste was tied to a stake and burned, while her earthly husband turned his armies aside and did nothing, for his heart had been devoured. But as he watched the pyre, the Archon softened. He took pity on Andraste and drew his sword, and granted her the mercy of a quick death. The Maker wept for his beloved, cursed Maferath, cursed mankind for their betrayal, and turned once again from creation, taking only Andraste with him. And Our Lady still sits at his side, where she still urges him to take pity on his children. From the Sermons of Justinia II. Article 105. The Avvars. Driven across the Frostbacks in ancient times, the Alamari tribesmen split into 3 groups. One settled the Ferelden Valley, one was pushed into the Kakari wilds, and the last returned to the mountains. Modern Fereldans bear little resemblance to their Alamari ancestors, and the chastened remember few of their traditions, but the Avvars have changed little throughout the ages. Like the chastened, the Avvars are not a united people. Each tribe fends for itself and is beholden only to its stain. They still follow their own gods, Korth the Mountain Father, Hakon Winter's Breath, the Lady of the Skies, as well as dozens of animal gods never named to outsiders. Nothing lasts in the mountains. Wind and rain eventually eat away the strongest holds. Valleys that were arable one generation are locked in year-round ice the next. Game is constantly on the move. Even among themselves, the Avvar make no absolute promises. They wed by a tradition in which the groom struggles to untie a tightly knotted rope, while the bride sings a hymn for one of the gods. However many knots he has undone by the time her song ends is the number of years she will spend with him. Lowlanders often forget that there is no such thing as a permanent alliance in the Frostbacks. From Ferelden, Folklore and History, by Sister Petrine, Chantry Scholar. Article 117, History of Ferelden, Chapter 1. Ferelden, as we think of it now, did not exist before the Exalted Age. Instead, the valley was divided up into dozens of old Alamari clans. They warred constantly with one another over land, honor, the allegiance of the freeholders, and on one notable occasion, the name given to a favorite Mabari. And then, in the 33rd year of the Exalted Age, Calenhad Theron became Terran of Denerim, and everything changed. Most of what we know about the founding of our nation comes from old songs that the bards passed down through the ages. The songs are filled with wild exaggerations and outright lies, but this hardly differs from the scholarly papers of some of my contemporaries. There is no agreement among poets or scholars on how he did it, but Calenhad gained the support of the Circle of Magi, and they crafted for him a suit of silvery white armor that by all accounts repelled both arrow and blade. Calenhad led his army across the valley and captured Redcliffe, one of only 3 men who ever successfully laid siege to that fortress, and presented himself to the bands of the Landsmeet as their king. The poets tell us that every lord knelt before Calenhad without question. The fact that he attended the Landsmeet surrounded by ash warriors and loyal mages of the Circle is generally omitted from the ballads, however. From Calenhad came the line of Theran kings and queens who reigned uninterrupted until the 44th year of the Blessed Age, when the Orlesian invasion came. The rightful king was forced to flee Denerim, and for 70 years a puppet sat upon the throne. From Ferelden, Folklore and History, by Sister Petrine, Chantry Scholar. Article 124, The Frostback Mountains. Even mountains had a heart once. When the world was young, Korth the Mountain Father kept his throne at the peak of Belenas, the mountain that lies at the center of the world, from which he could see all corners of earth and sky. And he saw strong men become weak, brave men grow cowardly, and wise men turn foolish for love. Korth devised a plan that he might never be betrayed by his own heart, by taking it out and hiding it where no soul would ever dare search for it. He sealed it inside a golden cask and buried it in the earth, and raised around it the fiercest mountains the world had ever seen, the Frostbacks, to guard it. But without his heart the Mountain Father grew cruel. His chest was filled with bitter mountain winds that shrieked and howled like lost souls. Food lost its flavor, music had no sweetness, and he lost all joy in deeds of valor. He sent avalanches and earthquakes to torment the tribes of men. Gods and men rose against him, calling him a tyrant, but with no heart Korth could not be slain. Soon there were no heroes left, either among men or gods, who would dare challenge Korth. The Lady of the Skies sent the best of her children, the swiftest, the cleverest, and strongest flyers, to scour the mountains for the missing heart, and for a year and a day they searched. But sparrow and raven, vulture and eagle, swift and albatross returned to her with nothing. The ptarmigan spoke up and offered to find the god chief's heart. The other birds laughed, for the ptarmigan is a tiny bird, too humble to soar, which spends half its life hopping along the ground. The lady would not give the little creature her blessing, for the mountains were too fierce even for eagles, but the ptarmigan set out anyway. Sorry, my eye is bothering me. The little bird traveled deep into the frostbacks. When she could not fly, she crawled. She hugged the ground and weathered the worst mountain winds, and so made her lonely way to the valley where the heart beat. With all the gods' terrible deeds, the heart was far too heavy for the tiny bird to carry, so she rolled it little by little out of the valley and down a cliff. When the golden cask struck the earth, it shattered. The heart was full almost to bursting, and the pain of it roused the mountain god to come see what had happened. When Korth neared his heart, it leapt back into his chest, and he was whole again. Then Hakon Winter's Breath bound the cord's chest with 3 bands of iron and 3 bands of ice, so it could never again escape. And all the remaining gods named the ptarmigan honored above even the loftiest eagles. The ptarmigan, an Avvar tale, from Ferelden Folklore and History by Sister Petrine, Chantry Scholar. Article 132. The Old Gods. Dumat, the Dragon of Silence. Dumat, the Dragon of Silence. Zazakel, the Dragon of Chaos. Toth, the Dragon of Fire. Andorel, and Dorel, the Dragon of Slaves. Erethmiel, the Dragon of Beauty. Razakael, the Dragon of Mystery. Lusican, the Dragon of Night. There were 7 old gods, great winged dragons that were said to rule over the ancient world. The Chantry maintains that they are responsible for the original sin, that they turned humanity away from its true creator through deceit. Humanity's faith faltered, and thus the Maker turned away from the world, but not before trapping the old gods in eternal prisons beneath the earth as punishment. Scholars assume that the old gods must indeed have been real at one point, but most agree that they were likely actual dragons, ancient high dragons of a magnitude not known today, and impressive enough to frighten ancient peoples into worshipping them. Some even claim that these dragons slumber as a form of hibernation, not as a result of the Maker's wrath. Regardless of the truth, the legend maintains that even from their underground prisons, the old gods were able to whisper into the minds of men. The Archon Thalcian, first of the Magisters who claimed to have contacted the old god Dumat, used the blood magic Dumat taught him to attain incredible power in Tevinter and declare himself ruler of an empire. In return, he established the first temples worshipping the old gods, and the dragons became equated everywhere with imperial power. To date, 4 of the old gods are said to have risen as corrupted archdemons. Dumat, the first and most powerful, was slain at the Battle of Silent Fields. Zazakel fell at the Battle of Starkhaven. Toth died at the Battle of Hunterfell, and Andorel was felled by Garahel, the legendary Grey Warden, at the Battle of Islay. The archdemons have been identified only after years of argument among the scholars, and to this day it's unclear whether the archdemons were truly old gods and not simply dragons. All that is known is that the Darkspawn hunt for them deep underground. If they are truly the old gods, as many scholars believe, then we only have 3 blights remaining. When all the old gods have risen and been slain? However, what will happen? Will the blights end forever, and humanity earn forgiveness from the Maker at last? We shall see. From The Old Gods Rise Again by Sister Mary, Chantry Scholar, 850 Blessed. Article 133. The Orlesian Empire. There are many lords and ladies in Val Royeaux, and I mean this literally. Once the system of noble titles in Orlais was labyrinthine. There were barons and barons and baronets and sub-barons and the horde of others, each with its own origins and own nuances of comparison. The Orlesian aristocracy is ancient and much given to competition. All the nobility play the grand game, as it is known, whether they wish to or not. It is a game of reputation and patronage, where moves are made with rumors and scandal, where moves are made with rumors, and scandal is the chief weapon. No gentle game, this. More blood has been drawn as a result of the grand game than any war the Orlesians have fought. Of this I am assured by almost every gentleman here. As far as titles went, everything changed with the coming of Emperor Drakon, who established the Orlesian Empire as it exists now, and who created the Chantry. There is no more venerated figure in Orlais. In Valrayo, the statues of Drakon stand as tall as the statue of Andraste. Stupid eye. Drakon determined that the grand game was tearing Orlais apart, so he abolished all titles besides his own and Lord and Lady. I am told, with some twittering amusement, that this action did not end the grand game as Drakon had intended. Now the lords and ladies collected unofficial titles rather than official ones, such as the exalted patron of Tassus Clay, or uncle to the champion of Tremis. It is a headache to remember such titles, and one winces to think of the poor doorman at the ball, who must rattle them off as each guest enters the room. Okay. The aristocracy is different from Ferelden in other ways as well. The Orlesians' right to rule stems directly from the Maker. There exists neither the concept of rule by merit nor the slightest notion of rebellion. If one is not noble, one aspires to be, or at least aspires to be in the good graces of a noble, and is ever watching for a way to enter the patronage of those better placed in the grand game. And then there are the masks and the cosmetics. I have not seen so much paint since the kennels at Highever, but that is another story. From Beyond the Frostbacks by Ban Tarek of West Hill 920 Dragon. Okay. Article 170. Arl Eamon Guerrin. Nobility does not exist without obligation. We owe all we have, even our lives, to our land and our people. As the maternal uncle of King Caelan, Arl Eamon is one of the king's most trusted advisors. Redcliffe, while not a large or especially wealthy part of Ferelden, is a critical strategic location. The fortress guards the western pass that leads to Orlais, as well as the major trade route with Orzammar. A well-respected man, though not the most charismatic. King Caelan once said of him, "My Uncle Eamon is a man everyone thinks of, when they remember to think of him at all." He fell ill with a mysterious condition that even magic could not treat. It was no common ailment. Eamon was poisoned by a blood mage, Jowen, who claimed to be working for Terran Logain. The Earl's life was saved only by the most extraordinary measure, the finding the urn of sacred ashes, the remains of Andraste herself. Article 173. Brother Ferdinand Genitivi. As it is the duty of all true sons of the Chantry to make the chant heard from every corner of the world, I made it my mission to find as many corners of the world as possible. The Maker can hardly expect us to do one without the other. I can't talk. Excerpt from In Pursuit of Knowledge, The Travels of a Chantry Scholar by Brother Genitivi. Brother Genitivi is one of the Chantry's most well-known scholars, primarily on the basis of the stories he has published, which many of his contemporaries dismiss as fanciful, of his travels across the length and breadth of Thedas. His travels and rather too curious nature led him to a study of folklore, which gave him the notion that he could track down the most debated of all artifacts, the urn of sacred ashes. He announced that he had found what appeared to be the trail of the urn left in the legends of the of the regions through which it had passed from Minrathous on its way into hiding. And he appears to have been right. The final resting place of Andraste lay at the summit of a remote mountain. He returned to Tenerum a little worse for wear, and was granted funds and manpower to mount an expedition to study the temple in which the urn is kept. Article 196. The Holy Brazier. The brazier that stands atop the stairs in the great hall of our temple has always been something of a mystery to us. This is the brazier that created the beings that we call the Ash Wraiths. This is where Andraste's followers immolated themselves and became eternal guardians of her temple. I have painstakingly pieced together information from old books and from the tales and half-truths passed down to us by our forefathers. I believe I now understand the ritual that used to create the wraiths. The brazier was lit with a consecrated taper, its flame taken from the everlasting fire that long ago consumed Andraste herself. The chosen disciple would fast and pray for weeks, taking into his body nothing but a sip of water a day. When the disciple was finally ready, he would place in his mouth a flawless black pearl and step into the flames. In ancient Tevinter, black pearls were thought to be magical, able to stop the soul from passing through the veil when held in the mouth at the moment of death. Thus Andraste's disciples consigned themselves to the eternal flame. They became dust and ashes and rose again and again to protect the most beloved of the Maker. From the Journal of Father Colgrim. Article 207. Death of a Templar. The dry, dusty earth swallows up the salty drops that splatter its surface. A tiny insect pauses, sensing the vibrations, and scurries off, leaving behind its invisible enemy. As the drops fall, the dark circles merge together, expressing a mirror to their creator. The primal emotions of bloodlust and sorrow blend into a lethal cocktail that breaks the strongest of men. The jurisdiction of strength must be left to the spirit, not arm nor chest. Only the wisest turn to his inner sanctuary to partition the mind from an all-consuming madness. Partition the mind from an all-consuming madness. Seductive voices whispering promise of glory waiting down the weaker path of the flesh, bringing a desire far worse than that of hot lead or steel. These blank, hollow promises will echo the unfathomable internally. Living comfortably amongst material possessions, it is easy to misunderstand the true meaning of uncontrollable hate, failing to understand the power of fighting against pure, unfaltering beliefs against foes that listen only to their soul. Uncontrollable hate influenced and thus removed from innocence. The scar is permanent and internal. The rain, now red, feeds the debt owed for actions past, seeking further into the earth as the mind draws slower. What was it that drew himself to this situation? The mind ebbs and parts to a lingering memory of true innocence. He entered war as a newborn, enters the world, unknowing of both the horrors and the light of the Maker that will save him. The sound of metal sliding along leather comes from above him. From the second he was born to his soon-to-be dying breath, his mind was processing and analyzing knowledge and experiences. It is true that he thought he could be wise in his own eyes, but only the most humble recognizes that he knows very little. Bias, speculation, and all of false pretenses make way to the sound of the sweeping steel. And then, finally, his soul, as ready as his eyes dry from this final understanding, enters his promise of its purest form. From Death of a Templar by Sir Andrew, Knight of Andraste and Templar Archivist, 9-4, Dragon. Article 212, The First Blight, Chapter 2. People today have little concept of the consequences of the second sin. Oh, believe me when I say that when That, when asked, pious chantry-going folk will curse the use of foul magic, spitting and snapping their fingers, but none live today who actually remember the horror that was unleashed so very long ago. Whatever records might have existed regrettably did not survive the chaos and ignorance that was to follow. We have only the tales of survivors handed down through the murky ages and the dogma of the chantry to instruct us, and that is precious little indeed. I believe I am not understating when I say that the second sin unleashed upon the bane upon bleh. I believe I am not understating when I say that the second sin unleashed the bane of all life upon Thedas. The Darkspawn are more virulent than the worst plague, a heartless force of nature that came into our world like an ill wind. We know from accounts of later blights, as these Darkspawn invasions came to be called, never has a more appropriate name existed, that the Darkspawn spread disease and famine wherever they tread. The earth itself is corrupted by their presence, the sky roiling with angry black clouds. I do not exaggerate, my friends, when I say that a mass gathering of Darkspawn is an omen of dread cataclysm. It is said that those cursed magisters who became the first Darkspawn scratched at the very earth to find solace in the darkness of the dwarven deep roads, and there in the shadows they multiplied. Whether by intelligent design or by some last vestige of worship in their minds, they attempted to locate the old gods they had once served. They found what they sought. Dumat, the first among the old gods, once known as the Dragon of Silence, before the Maker imprisoned him and all his brethren beneath the earth for the first sin, usurping the Maker's place in mankind's heart. The slumbering dragon awoke, freed from the Maker's prison by his twisted followers, and became corrupted himself. Dumat was transformed into the first archdemon, and his great and terrible power given will by a rotting, unholy mind. With the Darkspawn horde following, Dumat rose and took wing in the skies once again, bringing ruin to the world the Maker had created. The old god had become the eye of a dark storm that would ravage the entire world. From Tales of the Destruction of Thedas, by Brother Genitivi, Chantry Scholar. Article 213, The First Blight, Chapter 3. The world during the First Blight was different from the world we know today. Aside from the civilized rule of the Imperium, humans as a race were largely barbarous and splintered, divided into clans and tribes and squabbling amongst ourselves for resources. At the same time, deep beneath, Thedas's great mountain ranges spanned dwarven culture, as organized and advanced as ours was primitive. At the same time, beneath Thedas's great mountain ranges spanned a dwarven culture as organized and advanced as ours was primitive. As the Darkspawn bubbled up to the surface from their underground lairs, mankind first buckled and then fought back. The armies of Tevinter attempted to face down the multitudes of twisted creatures and the horrid rotting of the land around them, but they could not be everywhere at once. Human history remembers the First Blight as a time of terrible devastation, and those stories are accurate, but in our arrogance we often forget the price paid by the dwarves in their isolated mountain kingdoms. The dwarves faced far greater hordes than humanity as the Darkspawn challenged them for control of the underground. Despite the might and technology of the dwarves brought to bear, the savage Darkspawn tore through them, first destroying the remote taigs before swallowing up entire kingdoms. Think of it, an entire civilization lost in the space of decades. Compared to the near genocide that the dwarves faced, what we humans call the First Blight must have seemed a mere skirmish. Against the Darkspawn, the dwarven lands have always borne the brunt of the fighting, and the majority of the sacrifices. Four dwarven kingdoms finally managed to combine their might and fight back, and that cooperation saved them, but for the rest of their lands it was too late. The Darkspawn had taken the deep roads, the majestic underground passages that linked the dwarven lands throughout Thedas. The Darkspawn could now attack anywhere on the surface through these tunnels. Humanity simply was not prepared for such an onslaught, It was clear that the warfare we knew would not avail us. We had to find a new way to fight. Thus came our salvation. The Grey Wardens were born. From Tales of the Destruction of Thedas by Brother Genitivi, Chantry Scholar. Article 215. The Maker's First Children. The Maker's first creations were the spirits, glorious beings that populated many spires of the Golden City, and the Chant of Light says that they revered the Maker with unquestioning devotion. The Maker, however, was dissatisfied. Although the spirits were like him in that they could manipulate the aether and create from it, they did not do so. They had no urge to create, and even when instructed to do so, possessed no imagination to give their creations ingenuity or life. The Maker realized his own folly. He had created the spirits to resemble him in all but the one and most important way. They did not have a spark of the divine within them. He expelled all the spirits out of the Golden City and into the Fade, and proceeded to his next creation, life. The Maker created the world and the living beings upon it, separated from the Fade by the veil. His new children would be unable to shape the world around them, and thus would need to struggle to survive. In return for their struggle, the Maker gave them a spark of the divine, a soul, and he watched with pleasure as his creations flourished and showed all the ingenuity that he had hoped for. The spirits grew jealous of the living and coaxed them into the Fade when they slept. The spirits wished to know more of life, hoping to find a way to regain the Maker's favor. Through the eyes of the living, they experienced new concepts: love, fear, pain, and hope. The spirits reshaped the Fade to resemble the lives and concepts that they saw, each spirit desperately trying to bring the most dreamers into their own realm, so they could vicariously possess a spark of the divine through them. As the spirits grew in power, however, some of them became contemptuous of the living. These were the spirits that saw the darkest parts of the dreamers. Their lands were places of torment and horror, and they knew that the living were strongly drawn to places that mirrored those dark parts of themselves. These spirits questioned the Maker's wisdom and proclaimed the living inferior. They learned from the darkness they saw and became the first demons. Rage, hunger, sloth, desire, pride. These are the dark parts of the soul that give demons their power, the hooks they use to claw their way into the world of the living. It was demons that whispered into the minds of men, convincing them to turn from the Maker and worship false gods. They seek to possess all life as their due, forging kingdoms of nightmare in the Fade in hopes that one day storming the walls of heaven itself. And the Maker despaired once again, for he had given the power of creation to his new children, and in return they had created sin. From The Maker's First Children by Bedar, Senior Enchanter of Ostwick, 812 Blessed. Article 221. The Sermons of Divine Renata the First. The weakness of mortal will is the great failing of all the Maker's children. We trade our honor as if it were the cheapest of currency. We do not understand what integrity is or what it truly is worth. For this ignorance original sin was born. At some time each of us has thought, what does it matter if I keep hold of my integrity? I am but one mortal. I am powerless. How blind we all are! The virtue of a single slave destroyed the Tvinter Imperium. The dishonor of one man drove the Maker from our sight. I tell you truly, nothing but the integrity of our hearts will win the love of the Makers back to us. It is all the power we shall ever possess to change the world for good or for ill. From A Sermon on Integrity. Ugh. Gosh. I kept flubbing this left and right. Anyway, that's all for now. Thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.